Hello, I'm Teacher Jhea, and today we are going to discuss formalism. So, introduction to formalism. Formalism is a branch of literary theory and criticism which deals with the structures of text. So, it means that external agents outside of the text are not taken into consideration. All things about culture, politics, and the author's intent or societal influences are excluded from formalism. So, the focus in formalism is only on the text and the contents within the text such as grammar, syntax, signs, literary tropes, etc. So, another is formalism also brings the attention to structural tendencies within a text or across text such as genre and categories. Also, formalism is based on analysis of a text rather than a discussion on issues more distant to the text. So, formalism is based on the technical purity of a text. Formalism is divided into two branches, the Roshan formalism and New criticism. So, formalism argued that a text is an autonomous entity liberated from the intention of the author. So, a text, according to formalism, is a thing on its own without the need of external agents. So, as the name suggests, formalism is a scientific technical mode of understanding text which expects a greater degree of mental intelligence instead of emotional intelligence from the readers. So now let's tackle about the Russian formalism. So what is Russian formalism? Russian formalism was a school of literary criticism in Russia from 1910 to 1930. Some prominent scholars of Russian formalism were Viktor Slovsky, Yuri Tanyanov, Vladimir Pruk, Boris Ichenbaum, Roman Jacobson, Boris Tomaszewski, and Grigory Gakovsky. So, Russian formalism brought the idea of scientific analysis of poetry. So, Russian formalism alludes to the work of the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, Opoyaz, 1916, in St. Petersburg by Boris Ichibom, Viktor Slovsky, and Yuri Tyananov. So, it also refers to the Moscow Linguistic Circle founded in 1914 by Roman Jacobson. So, the principles of Russian formalism are as follows. So, analysis of literature should be factual. So, the linguistic will also be an aspect of Russian formalism, and literature is independent of external sources surrounding the text. So much for that. Now let's move on to New criticism. So what is New criticism? New criticism is an American literary theory in the 20th century. Its philosophy was taken from John Crow Ransom's The New Criticism, 1941. So, New criticism talk about the close reading approach. So, what is close reading approach? So, the close reading approach was a method developed by I.A. Richards in which only words on page were analyzed very closely in a text. It argued that a text should be very closely read and analyzed without referring to external materials and issues such as cultural, political, and economic, and others. So, New criticism did not deal with cultural, political, or social issues around a text. So, it dealt only with the textual world. So, now, let's talk about Viktor Slovsky. So, who is Viktor Slovsky? Viktor Slovsky of 1893-1984 was a Russian literary theorist. He belonged to the class of Russian formalism. He was also associated with the Russian army during the First World War. He founded Opoyaz, Society for the Study of Poetic Language, in the year 1916, which planted the seeds of Russian formalism. So, Viktor Slovsky opposed Bolshevism, a far-left Marxist faction. So, as an outcome of his dissent against Bolshevism, he went into hiding but was pardoned in 1919. So, he also took part in the Russian Civil War. So, Victor Slowsky coined the term defamiliarization in the essay Art as Device, which was part of the theory of prose 1925. So, defamiliarization is also known as estrangement. So, what is defamiliarization, by the way? So, defamiliarization is the act of making common entities unfamiliar to the reader. So, it argues that poetic language is different from practical language. So, the aim of practical language is to make things easily comprehensible and convey things based on factual assertion. So, practical language does not follow the method of defamiliarization as mentioned earlier. So, the idea of defamiliarization is aligned with poetic language instead of practical language. So, it is a poetic language that conveys sense through implication rather than through direct expressions. So, what is poetic language, which is the one that only align in the defamiliarization? So, poetic language or even subjective language is not totally based on factual assertion, and the aim is to make things more difficult to understand. So, thus poetic language follows the method of defamiliarization. So, defamiliarization argues that subjective language does not really have a concrete function of communicating facts. So, it argues that artistic language serves as an artistic function rather than a scientific function. So, another background of Slowsky is he was also a film theorist. He was a friend of filmmaker Sergei Einstein. So, these are the notable works of Victor Slowsky, include the Zoo or Letters Not About Love, 1923, Literature and Cinematography, 1923, Third Factory, 1926, and Theory of Prose, 1925. Now, let's move on to Boris Ichimbaum. So, Boris Ichimbaum, 1886-1959, was a Russian theorist. He represents Russian formalism. So, he was born in Voronezh, Russia. He studied biology, violin, and piano at school. He opted for philology in the year 1909. So, what is philology? So, philology is a branch of knowledge that deals with the structure and history of languages. So, Boris Ichimbaum was part of Opojaz, which was founded in 1916. So, as mentioned earlier, the Ipoya. So, Boris Ichimbaum was involved with the social movement, rootless cosmopolitanism. So, the term rootless cosmopolitanism was coined by Vissarion Velinsky. It was a pejorative referred to Jewish intellectuals and dissenters and to their lack of patriotism and lack of allegiance with the Russian state. So, the idea of rootless cosmopolitanism is a representation of the artistic struggle for freedom of expression and dissent. So, the rootless of existence is also an expression of freedom where an individual defines traditional boundaries of family, society, religion, and nation. So, Boris Ichimbaum's involvement with the idea of rootless cosmopolitanism was an intellectual pursuit of freedom against the authoritarianism of the nation. So, it was an idea that was liberating because the intellectual pursuit of knowledge and experience can only happen in a space that is not bound by too many rules. So, for instance, the hippie movement within America was a movement that also advocated absolute freedom against all forms of control. So, another is the Beat Generation within America was an artistic movement that also advocated for complete artistic freedom. Thus, such artistic movements also defy censorship in all forms. So, these are the notable works of Boris Ichimbaum, include the theory of the formal method, literary Morse, young Tolstoy, Anna Akhmatova, an attempt at analysis. Now, let's move on to Mikhail Bakhtin. So, who is Mikhail Bakhtin? Mikhail Bakhtin, 1895-1975, was a Russian literary critic. He brought forward a set of theories that were rooted in the idea of pluralism. So, Mikhail Bakhtin's Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics 1963 introduced the concepts of polyphony and unfinalizability. So, polyphony means a diversity of voices and perspective within a single narrative. Polyphony is a pluralistic setup in which a narrative uses multiple voices and perspective to tell the story. So, for instance, in Crime and Punishment, 1866, Raskolnikov's internal struggle is diversified through the writer's questioning and exploration of the mental state of the character. So, unfinalizability means that a character in a novel should never be concretely finalized or completed. So, incompleteness is the act of never reaching a stage of completeness, so that there is always an openness to any kind of alteration or change within the story. So, it is a kind of open-ended story. So, Mikhail Bakhtin introduced the concept of carnivalesque in Rabelais and his role 1968. So, carnivalesque refers to chaos as liberating force from oppression. So, it is a deliberate act of artistic degradation of abstractions that are otherwise considered noble and spiritual. So, the idea of carnivalesque is linked to another idea of grotesque realism. So, it talked about by Bakhtin. So, grotesque realism is a lowering of all forms of abstractions to the material level. It is a form of critique of the metaphysical world. So, the dialogic imagination, 1981, introduced the ideas such as chronotope, heteroglossia, and dialogism. So, what is chronotope? So, chronotope is the representation of time-space within a narrative structure. So, while dialogism means dialogue. So, dialogism is a rejection of monologue. So, according to the writer, the monologue was a reductionist in nature, while a dialogue was a open and diverse. So, another is heteroglossia. It is a set of varieties and contradictions within a single language. It is a rejection of the cohesive, unified nature of language. So, it argues that language should not be cohesive because conflicts and contradictions make the language more dynamic. So, the following are the notable works of Mikhail Bakhtin. So, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics 1963, Rabelais and His World 1968, The Dialogic Imagination for Essays 1981. So, that's all his notable work. So now, let's move on to Roman Jakobson. So, who is Roman Jakobson? Roman Jakobson, 1896-1982, was a Russian-American, so linguist and literary theorist. He was born on 11 October 1896 in Russia. He was part of the Mokal Linguistic Circle. So, Mokal Linguistic Circle was a group of social scientists active from 1915 to 1924. So, Jacobson also was a member of the Prague Linguistic Circle, which focused on structuralist literary analysis. He was also critical of the Bolshevik revolution because the revolution let the chances of creative freedom lose to conservatism and orthodoxy. He fled from Prague in 1939 for Denmark. He moved to Harvard University, US in the year 1949. So, Roman Jakobson defined 6 functions of language as communication functions. So, the following are the 6 functions designed by Jacobson. So, first is referential function. So, referential function refers to context or mental state or a situation. So while poetic function, it refers to a message for its own sake. So it is a process that tells how something is conveyed. It is and also it is an aesthetic function. So another is emotive function. So what is emotive function? Emotive function refers to the sender's mental state. So number 4, conative function. So conative function refers to imperatives received by a recipient of a message. So number 5, pathetic function. It refers to language of interaction between the sender and receiver. For instance, light chats about politics between two people. And the last one is the metalingual function. So what is metalingual function? Metalingual function refers to the use of language as code. So Roman Jacobson has also contributed to the field of linguistic typology. So linguistic typology is a branch of linguistics that does a structural classification of languages. So he has also contributed to the field of linguistic universals. So linguistic universals refers to a pattern which is common to all languages. So for instance, noun and verbs are common to all languages. So Roman Jacobson also brought forward an idea of markedness. So what is markedness? So markedness is the state of being unusual or standing out as different in comparison, so to regular form. It is an idea that is not based upon homogeneity, where every entity conforms to the regular form. So, notable works of Roman Jacobson include on Linguistic Aspects of Translation, 1959, Closing Statement, Linguistics and Poetics, so the Framework of Language, 1980, Question the Poetic, 1973, Six Lectures of Sound and Meaning, 1978, The Framework of Language, 1980, and The Sound Shape of Language, 1979, Verbal Art, Verbal Sign, Verbal Time, 1985, and Language in Literature, 1987, and lastly, Shifters and Verbal Categories on Language, 1990. So, next is John Crow Ransom. So, who is John Crow Ransom? So, John Crow Ransom, 1888-1974, was an American literary critic. He was the founder of New Criticism, so the other form of formalism. New Criticism was a formalist movement that emphasized the close reading of the text. So, the notable work of Ransom's include The World's Body, 1938, The New Criticism, 1941, Poems About God, 1919, Chills and Fever, 1924, Grace After Meat, 1924, Two Gentlemen in Bands, 1926, and Selected Poems, 1945, and Poems and Essays, 1955, God Without Thunder, 1931, So The World's Body, 1938, The New Criticism, 1941, A College Primer of Writing, 1943, The Kenyon Critic Studies in Modern Literature, 1951, and Poetic Sense, A Study of Problems in Defining Poetry by Content, 1971, and lastly, Beating the Business, Selected Essays. So, let's move on to William K. Winsett. So, here's William K. Winsett. So, William K. Winsett, intentional fallacy. William, 1907-1975, was an American literary theorist and professor. So, Wimsatt's Verbal Icon, 1954, was written by Beardsley. In this book, Wimsatt brought out the idea of intentional fallacy. So, intentional fallacy refers to the error or evaluating a work by the intention of an author. So, it is based upon a rejection of the omniscience of an author over a text. So, it argues that an author's intention or design should not influence the reading of a text. So, while the affective fallacy by Winsett brought forward another theory which was called affective fallacy. So, affective fallacy refers to the error of evaluating a text through the emotional response of the reader. So, it means that a reader should not be driven by emotional impact to evaluate or understand a text. So another is the concrete universal, which is both by Wimsatt. So he brought forward the idea of the concrete universal, which refers to a degree of precision that does not contribute anything to the argument, but it is for its own sake. So it implies that the concrete universal is static rather than practical in nature. So in the domain of criticism, Wimsatt argues against the idea of reducing a poem or artistic entity to a purely aesthetical mode. So here, he argued that artistic entity should not be reduced to only aesthetical effects. The notable works of William K. Wimsatt include Hateful Contraries, 1965, The Verbal Icon, 1954, and that's the only notable works of Wimsatt. So next is Monroe Beardsley. So Monroe Beardsley, 1915-1985, was an American literary critic. So Beardsley was born and raised in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So he was educated at Yale University, BA 1936, PhD 1939. So where he received the John Addison Porter Prize. So he taught a number of colleges and universities, including Mount Holyoke College and Yale University. His wife and occasional co-author, Elizabeth Lane Beardsley, was also a philosopher at Temple. So he is known to have written two seminal essays, Intentional Fallacy and Affective Fallacy, mentioned earlier in Wimsatt. So intentional fallacy states that a work of art should not be evaluated from the intention of the author or what the author had intended. So, while affective fallacy states that a work of art should not be evaluated by the emotional effect that it can have on the reader. So, according to this theory, the act of reading should be based on intelligence rather than sentiment or political issues. So, in a way, the theory is very different from New Historism, where a text can never be read in isolation from history. So, other notable works of Monroe Beardsley include the Practical Logic, 1950, Aesthetic, A Short History, 1965. So, that's the two notable works of Beardsley. So, last but not the least, T.S. Eliot. So, he is T.S. Eliot. So, T.S. Eliot, 1888-1965, was a poet, playwright, and literary critic. He held dual citizenship of the UK and America. So, T.S. Eliot's poetry represented a departure from Romanticism. His poetry was marked by cynicism and modernism, questioning of traditional values and norms. So, his poetry had modernist expressions. So, T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, 1915, delineated a sense of decay within life, which was one major philosophic trait within modernism. So, Prufrock symbolizes physical and intellectual impotency. So, Prufrock was an anti-hero. So, T.S. Eliot's Hollow Man, 1925, represented a hollowness of life and ignominy which cannot be brought down. So, the poem shows the uneventfulness of life where people don't get any deliverance from their personal hells. The poem is also a reflection of the broken modern life where heroism is absent. So, T.S. Eliot's The Waste of Land, 1922, is a modernist poetry which is divided into 5 parts. The 5 parts are as follows. So, first, the burial of the dead. Second, a game of chess. Third, the fire sermon. Fourth, death by water. And fifth, what the thunder said. So, the poem also alluded to Shanti to convey a sense of peace. So, the poem concludes with the sense that destruction leads to regeneration. So, T.S. Eliot also wrote tradition and individual talent. So the literary text talks about a sense of balance between tradition and individual talent. So it argued that individual genius cannot be divorced from tradition. So he also wrote the Hamlet and His Problem. So where he talked about objective correlative, so which establishes a connection between living and living things and objects. So his other notable works include the um, Ash Wednesday 1930, Four Quartets 1943, the Cocktail Party 1949, Murder in the Cathedral 1935. So T.S. Eliot was awarded Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1948. So I think that's all about formalism. Thank you for listening and watching.